Welcome to State of Mind. This is Julian Royce. Today I'm speaking with a fellow psychedelic assisted therapist named Andreas, and he is a teacher of mine. I took a training with Innate Path, and he is a teacher there, along with Jen Pfizer, who was featured on another episode of this podcast earlier this year. And Andreas works from a real somatic and trauma-informed framework. And we actually don't get to talking about psychedelics specifically until about halfway through our conversation. But all of this conversation is directly related to the wise use of psychedelic medicine in general and to psychedelic assisted therapy in particular. And Andreas shares quite a bit about the topic of disassociation, which is a really important topic. And so, as listeners of this podcast, I've had a number of episodes related to psychedelics and psychedelic assisted therapy. And this one really adds to the conversation. It's not really repeating what we've talked about in the past on here. And in particular, this deep dive into the topic of disassociation will really be worth your time listening to. It's a tricky thing to work with. And Andreas is really good at discussing it, and I think really good at working with it with clients. And I think the information here will help you to notice it more in your own life, because we all disassociate to some degree or another throughout our day. It's normal. And in fact, daydreaming has been shown in studies to be really important to the creative process. Some really creative people consciously spend time just kind of daydreaming, letting their mind wander, and some beautiful ideas can come out of that. Of course, it's not good when it's happening unconsciously or compulsively, or when it's happening in response to difficult situations. And as I talk about with Andreas, it can be very subtle. And this topic of disassociation, it's relevant not just to therapy, not just to psychedelic assisted therapy. It's also very relevant to anyone interested in yoga, meditation, and spirituality in general. And Andreas is actually also a yoga teacher, and so we get to discuss that as well. And in the context of yoga meditation, we briefly touch on, the famous 8 limbs of yoga from Patanjali, one of which, I think it's the fifth one, is called pratyahara, which literally means withdrawal. And so you're withdrawing your senses kind of into consciousness itself as part of kind of meditative yogic practice. And of course, that can be disassociative. And it is disassociative, not necessarily in a bad way, but you're, in that context, disassociating from being involved with the world around you. And so we talk about that. There's just a really interesting topic. And there's differences in the different meditative traditions of how they teach and talk about the path of meditation and the goal of it. And it's really a long, ongoing debate around what it means to be fully present, what it means to really be mindful, and what it ultimately means to be awake to ultimate reality. Is that experience something radically separate from this world of sensory experience that we're all having, or does it include that? And as listeners of the podcast know, I'm on the Buddhist side of the street, but within the Buddhist tradition, there's so much debate around those topics. So if that is a topic of interest to you, we touch on it briefly. I'd love to discuss it more in the podcast in the future. As always, send me a message. Let me know what you think. You can learn more about my work at stateofmindcounseling.org, and you can learn more about this podcast at stateofmindpodcast.com. Without further ado, I bring you the great and powerful Andreas. Andreas Zambrano. I'm saying that right or wrong?
You're saying it well enough.
Well enough.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. And we met at a training for an organization called Innate Path, which is training people to do psychedelic assisted therapy legally with ketamine and cannabis. How long have you been working in the field?
About 4.5 years.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great.
Since the inception of Innate Path. I was the first employee, the first therapist on board.
Oh, amazing. So listeners of the podcast, we had Jen Pfizer on an earlier episode, and she was great. Another founding member, is that what you'd say?
I wouldn't say founding member, but since I was there from the beginning, I pretty early on I became a supervisor there, and at this point, really the two people that are at the helm of Innate Path the most are Jen and I. We're running the training program, which the Innate Path used to be a clinic, somatic, psychedelic assisted therapy clinic, and now it's more of a collective of therapists and a training organization.
Beautiful. Yeah, and do you want to share a little bit about your background and how you got into this work?
Sure. Well, I'm from Colombia, and I've been in the States for 9 years. I came to the States to study psychotherapy at Europa. I did the contemplative program. And after I graduated, I did 3 years of wilderness therapy in Utah.
Oh, wow.
In an addictions treatment program. And during that period, I had a friend suggest to me to go see a presentation by Saj Razvi. So yeah, Saj, who was one of the founders of Innate Path, somebody pointed out he was going to be doing a training, a workshop, 3-day workshop, I think, on MDMA and somatic trauma therapy. At that point, in Europa, really in the contemplative program, the body doesn't come in too much into the picture. And I was already starting to be really curious about somatic work. So I went and saw him, and this changed everything for me. It was an immediate, this is it. This is what makes sense to me. He's speaking my language. So
you were a student at Europa University, and
yes, I was right.
The somatic body piece hadn't been taught so much?
Barely.
Barely at all? Okay.
Barely, shockingly, very little.
And say his name again?
Saj Razvi.
Saj Razvi.
So Saj and Janet were actually the founders of Europa. I mean, not Europa, of Innate Path.
Right.
I want to share something also personal, which was when I was in this workshop, from a theoretical point of view, I was so excited. Like I said, this is what makes sense to me. But also as he was going over all these different lists of how trauma shows up in the body, I was shocked that I was mentally checking most of the boxes. And after a while, for myself.
Wow. Yeah.
And I hadn't really seen myself in that light. I'm a somewhat functional human being. And always known that I've struggled with depression and other things. And when I started to see that, it was both a moment of acknowledgement of my own pain and my own heartbreak, but at the same time it was so freeing to realize that all these things that I thought were just that I didn't know how to do life like most people did, that it was actually my trauma. So that's really what sparked my curiosity. And after that...
Wow. Do you want to say what some of those things were that you noticed in yourself?
Yeah.
Or just in general for people?
Yeah, for sure. So I remember, and this is something that now I teach, and in the training we go over this quite a bit. Stress and trauma affect the nervous system in many different ways. And there's the sympathetic threat responses. Sympathetic is the fight or flight response. The active response to trauma, where as I'm met with a threat, my body has all this extra energy to actually deal with the threat. So fighting, screaming, doing something about it. So when you're having these reactions in your body, some of the more common things that you feel are anxiety, hypervigilance, you're jumpy, you're uncomfortable in your skin, restlessness, insomnia, irritability, anger, things like that. So those to me were more familiar. And I knew I had a bunch of that, especially the anxiety piece. But seeing it broken down in a very detailed way was shocking, and how much I matched all of that. But then the other side that really was new to me, and I think is new to a lot of people in the mental health world, and even people who are pretty deep into it, is just how much impact there is on the dissociative level, so the parasympathetic nervous system.
Oh yeah.
So what happens is, one way at least to make sense of it is that when we're exposed to a threat, our first first mechanism to engage with the threat is that fight or flight response. We have this energy to do something, and when the threat becomes excessive, when it becomes overwhelming, when there's somehow this sense of these active responses that I have available aren't working, then the body goes into a passive response, which is shutdown, numbness, pain relief. The opiates in our brain are released, and then we go into the whole world of dissociation, which has a huge impact on people. Most people live their life with a fair degree of dissociation present, but because it's so much more subtle than the fight or flight symptoms. Fight or flight, the anxiety, the tension in your body, your jaw tight, your shoulders tight, that's obvious. You notice it. It's in your face.
Right.
Dissociation is not quite as loud. So people live their whole life and they don't really realize that, for example, when they get triggered, maybe they get into an argument with somebody, for example, that they all of a sudden they start to get sleepy, or their body gets heavy, or they get a little bit dizzy, or
spacey.
Spacey, confused. There's so many different signs like that.
Yeah.
If you pay attention very closely to the body, and I found this one to be fascinating, it takes a pointed awareness to notice it, and that's part of what I help my clients notice, is that when the dissociative response comes up, you start to feel distortions in your body. So your body feels too heavy or too light. It feels too big or too small or oddly shaped.
Yeah.
So sometimes, for example, people are lying down on the couch and they say, I feel like I'm upside down and my feet are pointing toward the sky. Or I feel like my head is the size of a balloon and my feet are tiny.
And those are signs of disassociation happening.
Yes. So when Saj spoke about this was the part that really struck me. Because I had some awareness of it, but it was very vague. I had never been able to speak it or put my finger on it.
Yeah.
And remembering how, as a kid in elementary school, it was a very overwhelming period of my time, of my life. And I remember the running joke in my family was, I'm so distracted, so forgetful, just losing things all the time.
Yeah.
And it was me being in these dissociative states as a trauma response. And I remember just at one point realizing that I could almost trigger it willingly. The life was so hard that I could blast myself into these dreamy headspaces and just sort of disappear out into the ethers. And I had no idea that was what was happening.
Yeah.
And that's what's been behind this ongoing theme of being kind of aloof and forgetful and things like that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I really can relate to that a lot, actually. And I think that, I don't even know where to begin, but to start off with, like, it's normal, it's human.
Yes.
Beautiful things can come from daydreaming and imagination, and you can also get lost there. And it can also, like, just see these habitual patterns we create as children, right, carry through our lives. And to be able to see the gifts in them, as well as the, unhelpful pieces, to put it in a very, light way. But that, I think it's just, like, use the word subtle. It's more subtle. If you're experiencing intense anger and you're lashing out, that is, more obvious and easier to see and work with in some sense.
Yes.
Versus a shutdown or a checking out, and it can be so subtle where you're even present talking with someone, and yet a part of you has kind of checked out because it's a difficult conversation, right? So it's like there's these degrees to it. So I think part of the way that I'm understanding trauma, it's with, like, so much mental health stuff, it's a spectrum that we're all a part of, we're all on some level. And some people have, so much of it that it becomes really problematic in their life, right? And that would be a more severe mental health issue. But for the average person, it's like we can relate, like something like narcissism. Like, we all have, like, some amount, and we can work with it, and we can get better. Hopefully it's not pathological. right? And like, so with like trauma and disassociation, it's there and you can see it, and there's just like levels to it, gradients to it. And yeah, so I want to offer that for people to kind of like normalize the conversation.
Absolutely.
So like part of being alive is difficult things, and trauma builds up in our system. And I'm wondering if like psychedelics can kind of help people in general, not just people with severe mental health issues, but people in general to kind of clear that stuff out. Because as you go through life, I think it tends to build up. And then there's some people that maybe are just kind of bulldozing through and maybe kind of ignoring that. And some people that are more sensitive, more introspective, they take time to like really look at themselves honestly, and then you'll see these things like, oh yeah, there's some stuff here, and like we all have some stuff, right? So.
Absolutely, life is overwhelming at some point for everybody.
Yeah.
So we do build that up, and the other thing is, there's different ways of I guess defining trauma, if you will. Not too long ago, the general idea of what trauma meant was these catastrophic, massive events,
right?
Like coming back from war,
right,
or having sexual abuse or things like that are very, very big and easy to pinpoint.
Right, or you were mugged or something, right?
Right. But then one thing that is really apparent is that the way I see it is that there's a certain threshold. We can take so much stress before we cross a threshold and we get into the realm of trauma, where a system recognizes there's no solution here. I need to go into my passive defenses, which is the dissociation. And in different moments of our life, our threshold might be very high and we have a lot of resilience. We can take all this stress and we're fine. But as in different situations, we're not so strong. We don't have as much support or whatever it is. And that threshold just goes lower and lower.
Right.
And at that point, normal, you could say everyday stress, if it sustains over a certain amount of time, it flips over to the
right.
side of dissociation and trauma. So everybody,
it's a great point,
has some of this in their system. Everybody has some of these dissociative responses. And like you said, I'm glad you brought this up. It's an amazing response. It's the kindest thing that our system can do in really extreme moments. So as a therapist, part of my job when I'm working with somebody that has dissociation is I do gradually want to help them be less associated, because what happens is dissociation is there's a certain loss of self. There's a loss of connection and attunement to myself. If I'm being numbed out, if the signals in my body are literally being numbed out, there's less signs for me to read of what's going internally. But also, I think it creates a bit of an emotional blankness that also makes us less likely to connect with others.
Right. Part of the cost to it is maybe less energy, vibrancy, aliveness, connection, depth,
absolutely.
Intimacy. Yeah.
And a lot of times we don't want to just how do I put this? The dissociation has a like I said, it has a beautiful protective quality to it. And just like any, you could say, unhealthy mental pattern, it has some wisdom, at least at some point when it first came to being. It was a strategy that was helpful.
Right. So
it's really important to align with that protective strategy and recognize it as such, and then slowly offer different possibilities and different solutions to shift that.
Like I said, align with that strategy. Like align with it, appreciate it, and then it can. Maybe the way I think about it is almost like that habit or strategy can then start to shift from within itself, so to speak, because it like by appreciating it, acknowledging it, then you can see the goodness in it, and then it can want to change. So it's not like fighting against it.
Yes, absolutely. I do some parts work, some family systems work, and one of the most helpful little nuggets that I found around this is actually from a guy called Bill Plotkin.
Oh yeah.
Who does a lot of wilderness spiritual therapy work. And he talked about the idea of the loyal soldier, that we all have these parts that are like soldiers that are ready that jump into action and protect because that's their mission. And they get so caught up in their mission that it becomes problematic.
Yeah.
They're too quick to react. And what he suggests is doing this visualization, kind of like an internal ceremony of welcoming them back as heroes from war, and telling them, thank you for your service. The war is over. We will call you back if we need you. So it's that alignment, and that's just one way of aligning with these parts and these protectors.
I like that.
They have a very important role in the system, and they always will. There are times where the best thing you can do actually is become numb and shut down. I think.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, like, if there were, do you want to speak to that? Like, what would an example of that be?
Well, anytime that you're exposed to extreme pain, really, I think in the moment, it can just be too much, and you can then process it, integrate it a little bit by bit afterwards. But in the moment when life is just tearing you apart, it's helpful to have to dissociate a little bit. I went through a big breakup a year and a half ago.
Oh, wow.
And I could see myself going into these states over and over. And there were moments when I felt very grateful that they were there, actually.
Yeah.
There were some really painful things that in the moment, it was too much. I didn't have the capacity to feel into them and navigate them with my full awareness. So there's a value of, putting things away for later when you actually do have the capacity to work with them.
I think about that, like, consciously compartmentalizing, that you can develop a skill to put something to the side.
Yes.
Do your job, do your family, do your work, whatever, and then come back to it when you're resourced, when it's the right time.
Exactly.
It's an important skill in trauma therapy.
Yes, yeah. And the key is that, everybody's checking out in some ways, but it has a very automatic, reactive quality. But there is a way of actually intentionally checking out a little bit, recognizing I am at my limit right now. And, I could use something to help me not be so in it and give my system a break. And then maybe the next day, okay, let's feel into what's happening now. I feel a little bit more centered. Let's move this through a little bit. And it reminds me of the practice, which in Europa, they talk about the practice of touch and go.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Where you intentionally touch into something that's hard. So it might be that if you feel like you have the capacity and the energy, for example, you sit down, you take a moment to center and settle yourself, and then maybe you move towards, say, grief. There's some grief that that you've been feeling that you haven't processed, and then you actually make yourself bring it up in your system and activate those emotions and touch into them and allow yourself to feel them. But you don't want to just be swamped by them and then not be able to function and push your body and your mind a little bit too far. So then you go and you intentionally go. and there's ways of going. There are many ways of going, but one way of going is actually intentionally checking out a little bit.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of power in having choice. I mean, you can start to have some more choice around it.
Exactly.
It's good.
I also want to say one quick thing about dissociation that I'm personally fascinated by, and I don't know the answer to this one, but it's one that I'm very curious about, because just like a fight or flight response, or rather a sympathetic nervous system response, has a positive and a negative side. The positive would be enthusiasm and vitality and this excitement and energy and joy, right? This like liveliness. The not helpful side is the I'm so tense in my body and I'm getting a headache because I'm so tense and I'm hypervigilant and reacting to every little sound, all that, right? So it has both sides. Dissociation is the same. There's the, or let me put it this way, a parasympathetic response is the same. It has, the healthy side is rest and sleep and relaxation. And you could say that most meditation practices actually bring in a positive dissociative state.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
And this depends on, there's so many different styles of meditation. By the way, I've been teaching yoga and meditation for 15 years.
Oh wow.
So this is a personal curiosity that I hold. Like, how is one dissociation so different from the other one? But for example, in the yoga tradition, in the teachings of Patanjali, the first step of the first of the four steps of meditation is I'm blanking out on the Sanskrit word. Anyway,
Pratyahara or something like that.
No, I bet it'll come to me by the end of the
It's
session.
a yoga word I'm trying to think of right now too, where you like withdraw your senses.
Yes, exactly. Withdrawing the
Yeah.
senses, because it's the fifth of the eight limbs of Patanjali.
Right.
And it is a withdrawal of the senses. So in a way, it's dissociation. It's being less in your physical body. So of course, that these practices are incredibly powerful and they're incredibly helpful. But then the interesting thing is how you use them. There's so many. I was for the first few years that I was practicing yoga diligently, I thought that I was growing, evolving so much as a human being because I was creating this capacity of managing my emotions that I didn't have before. And after many years of that, I realized, oh, I've just been bypassing. I've been using this dissociative practice to create a really powerful coping skill.
Right.
So it's like, coping skill can be any coping skill can be good or bad depending on how you use it. You can drink, or you can watch TV, or you can go to the gym. And I felt like the more I was practicing, the less in touch I was actually with some of this these wounds that I had never taken care of.
Oh wow.
And I see that a lot in the work that I do. Anecdotally, I'll say some of the people from the somatic point of view, some of the hardest people that I work with are people that have a bunch of experience with meditation.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And psychedelics too.
Oh really? Okay.
Yeah, because they're used to using these mechanisms as a way of actually avoiding some of the charge that they carry in their system.
Right. So what you're saying is these meditative and yogic and whatever other they can be techniques to deal with discomfort or deal with something that's difficult or trauma even, and then if you're doing that, then you're not really feeling the thing itself. Is that often?
Usually, I even venture to say usually. And more often than not, it's used like that. It means it's not a bad thing. It's an incredible coping skill.
Coping skills, right?
Where there's something that's hard, and we do something to manage it, right? Like I said, we might be watching Netflix, or it might be eating pizza, or it might be going to the gym.
Yeah.
It becomes one of the most powerful coping skills you can have if you're not intentionally using your practice to actually help you tune into some of the unpleasant things that are happening in there too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a good question and such a good inquiry. And so I really appreciate it. And yeah, I think again, to be conscious and have choice. Like if I am going to sit down to meditate or practice mindfulness maybe I really need deep relaxation. There's this new term that I've seen in some psychological studies now called non-sleep deep rest. I don't know if I'm getting that right. Deep rest, non-sleep. There's some acronym they have for it, and you can do that. And it can be so powerful. You get like a sense of recharge.
Yeah, absolutely.
I could, sit for 5 or 10 minutes and deeply rest and feel renewed for my day, for example. That's going to be very different than really feeling into something that's unresolved or a difficult sensation. But I can have choice around that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's some pretty well-known meditation teachers out there who do, I think, use the tool to dive a little bit deeper into some of the patterns that are not in balance inside.
Yeah, it makes me. I'm having memories of. I had a meditation teacher, Reggie Ray, who's had some controversy, but he's a very powerful teacher and really focusing on the body. And he, I remember being on retreat with him, and him, I think, in his own way, speaking to what you're speaking, like stop the technique or stop the practice and be with whatever it is right now that you, whatever it is. And so I think in Buddhism, at least, probably in yoga too, there's a long history of this kind of inquiry that you're having actually, where Zen teachers of break the practice or stop whatever it is you're doing, stop it. Maybe you're in some deep state of samadhi, but maybe it's that avoiding, or maybe you're not quite as awake to the here and now as you could be. So yeah.
and that just makes me think about a whole other rabbit hole that I don't think we need to get into right now, but it's related, which is, I think a lot of times why in spiritual communities such really nasty things end up happening, like abuses of power, sexual abuse, all these things, is because I think some people become like the Olympians of avoidance and through their practice. So to some extent they are in these extremely expansive states of consciousness that they have really tapped into some form of alignment, but then they haven't taken care of all the stuff that's in the basement,
right?
And it comes out sideways,
right? That's another good
part of what happens there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's been so many scandals. Like I just mentioned Reggie Ray, and he had some of his top students wrote a public letter a couple years ago, basically accusing him of kind of spiritual abuse. There was no sexual or financial or physical abuse or anything like that, but anyway, they were unhappy and they felt that he had been kind of abusing his power in some way or another. And I don't want to take a side or get into it too much, but that's, there you go. I mean, there's so many examples of that in religious communities and spiritual groups.
And I think that's one of the big pieces. They use this amazing tool that inherently creates some version of dissociation, and then you become less in touch with some of the some of your shadows, some of the parts that are driving unconscious behavior, and you become attached to these very blissful, expansive states. So then you actually feel less inclined to feel into the really, really unpleasant parts of your experience. Yeah, like the fear and the grief and the shame and all the other stuff.
Right. Yeah. I guess, I think keep using this word inquiry. I like that word. I don't have an answer to it, but I think it's good for, especially when people get involved with meditation, with yoga, to ask themselves that, or with therapy, a lot of therapy too. That there's all these tools and techniques and they have their value, and then maybe eventually limitation, they can become a place of comfort or a place of, which isn't bad in of itself, but there's limitations, right, to any approach. And I think if you really study the Buddhist teachings, at least in Tibetan Buddhism, like the Dzogchen teachings, it talks about non-meditation. So the way some teachers talk about that is you get really good at meditation, and then you need to learn how to non-meditate. Right. And then some teachers are from the very beginning, you can just non-meditate. But that's not the same as an ordinary person going through the world. It's some kind of wakefulness, awareness, connection with everything. Right. But one that doesn't require some specialized technique that you become really good at, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. And talking about this full of life way of non-meditatively going through the world. It reminds me of one of the, when people come to me, clients come to me for psychotherapy, they usually have a list of the things that they want to see change. I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm having intrusive thoughts, whatever it is. And healing often feels and looks different than I think you would expect. I have this personal experience for myself. And one of the things that changes most, that I get more often, is feedback from my clients. The changes, they just feel more awake, more alive, and more synchronicity.
I love that. That's good feedback, right?
Yeah, that's feedback. And the interesting thing is, a lot of times the things that they felt would be the main indicator that they're healing, those don't necessarily change. What I mean by that is, I think people have this idea that great mental health is being happy all the time, and that because they're depressed a lot, then the being well is just not being ever depressed. And really, what it usually ends up meaning is people are going to be depressed on and off. If they have a history of depression,
right?
They're never. Well, maybe sometimes they're just never going to be depressed. But for the most part, they're still going to cycle through it. If they have somebody has anxiety, they're going to cycle in and out of anxiety probably for the rest of their life. But the relationship to it changes, and it's not this thing that is so pervasive and controls everything. So sometimes the symptoms that they think, I'm going to be well when there's no anxiety, that maybe that doesn't happen, but there is this aliveness that does come, and I think especially from starting to shift some of the dissociation.
Yeah, that seems like, to me, like more fundamental. Like we talk about fight, flight, response, and then the disassociation is a little bit deeper than that, right? Is that a good way to look at it?
Yeah.
And so working with that, it makes sense that would then help everything else in your nervous system to be more regulated and more responsive. And as part of how you would work with disassociation with the client you're working with, like to notice it in the moment, in the session?
Absolutely.
How do you, because that to me is such a mystery. Like, how do you notice that? Like, how do you do that?
It is a bit of a mystery, and it's from my particular training, which for the record is in a style called trauma dynamics, which is an offshoot of somatic experiencing.
Okay.
Peter Levine. It's very similar. However, the training that I have actually, I think, focuses more intently on dissociation than most trauma modalities. And I would say that working with fight or flight is relatively easy. You can help somebody find the tools to work that and move it out of their system in a few sessions. Working with this dissociation is a long, slow. Dissociation by nature is sluggish. It takes perseverance and discipline and time.
Perseverance, discipline, and time. Yeah.
It does. And as a therapist, it takes a lot of creativity, actually.
Oh, okay.
And not only that, anytime dissociation shows up, it's usually linked to hopelessness.
Oh, wow. Because
in that moment when I was talking about the threshold of there's this threat that I'm reacting to with fight or flight, with stress, when that threshold flips into passive response, parasympathetic, the general experience in your system is there's no solution. There's nothing I can do to manage this threat.
It's like a hopelessness.
So it has hopelessness. It's just embedded in it. So if your client is showing up in session and they're super dissociated and there's hopelessness coming up, as a human being with a nervous system that resonates with other human beings, you're going to get flooded with hopelessness too. It's something that just comes up over and over.
So you'll notice it in your own system.
Yeah, I'm like, I can't help this person.
Oh, wow.
They're never going to get well.
And that's a clue that they are experiencing.
Yes,
that's fascinating.
exactly.
Yeah.
And not only that, I think because I have experienced so much dissociation in my system, even if my client doesn't recognize in the moment that they're having dissociation, oftentimes we're working on whatever we're working, and all of a sudden I get hit, and I get trippy, I get floaty, I get a little bit dizzy, like my vision changes, and it's a cue to me that my client is probably experiencing dissociation. And usually when I ask them to really focus on the different signs that might be showing up, it's happening.
That's beautiful. It takes a real kind of, I don't know what the word is, meta-awareness or strong awareness, because you're aware that you're, oh, wait, I'm checking out a little bit, and then they are too. And yeah, subtle, like we said.
Yeah, and we humans, like I said, we, like it or not, for better or for worse, we resonate with each other so much. Somebody's in a particular mood, and we just pick up on it without even trying. And there's all this research on mirror neurons and things like that. And we visually pick up on cues, but I think there's an energetic quality to it.
Absolutely.
That is being tapped into.
It's the real value of working with a good therapist. They're putting their attention with you and on you, and then obviously that helps so much. I mean, there's a reason why therapy can help and work. And it can be hard to, I guess one thing I'm thinking about is it can be so challenging to try to do this type of work on your own, because by definition, if you're disassociating, you're not quite there.
Yep, exactly.
Have someone there who could catch that is so valuable.
And the other thing is, if the therapist is centered in their sense of safety, if they know that whatever comes up for the client in the moment is going to be okay, the client is also picking up on that at the same time. So it allows the client's process to go deeper.
Yeah. You're like lending them a sense of safety, helping create a sense of safety.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to go back to the question you asked a moment ago about how do exactly you work with dissociation, I'll just say, like I said, it's complex, and it's kind of like an art form. It's not a cookie cutter, a protocol or something. But there's a couple of things. One of the main things is helping the client notice how dissociation feels in their body is essential, and that goes very, very long, because it's subtle. Like I said, most people, when you start to ask them to notice, do you feel too heavy, too light? Do you feel anywhere where your body is all of a sudden getting chill? Do you feel confused, distracted? It's not super obvious. It takes some practice to build that somatic awareness to where they can actually start to say, oh yeah, I feel like my legs are super long.
Oh, well.
Or I feel like I'm spinning in the room or something like that. And that awareness changes things. It kind of starts to dispel the dream, if you will. It has a bit of a sobering quality, and then they can track it in their daily life, and they can realize, oh, I guess I just got more triggered than I thought, and now I'm feeling trippy.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is.
I love that when you can take that and apply it in your day-to-day life. And then if you're seeing a therapist like yourself regularly, then you can bring that to, like, oh, last week this happened and I noticed it. And it's like, wow, that's the real growth to me, when it's permeating your everyday life and you're starting to change. That's going to change your world. Yeah.
The caveat to that is that dissociation is usually comfortable. Fight or flight is uncomfortable in the body. Your muscles are tight, and you feel like you want to crawl out of your skin, and there's all these sensations that are just so unpleasant. Your stomach is churning. Dissociation is often very pleasant. You feel like you're floating on a pink cloud somewhere.
The pink cloud, yeah.
That's a very common sensation of floating when you're feeling dissociated. So when somebody has had a bunch of dissociation and they actually start to come out of it, it's a bit of a shock. It's like all of a sudden I feel everything, and I'm raw, and I don't have this cloud that buffers me from the pain of the world. So that's can be an intense landing into earth.
Yeah.
And
wow.
And I've had, usually what I see is that people go through a couple of months of where they feel pretty unsettled by that shift. And then they realize, oh, I've been gone. I've been missing out.
Yeah.
So it's usually appreciated, but it has some growing pains to it. And I want to say two more things about how you work with it. One of the keys of dissociation is, like I said, there's this feeling of lack of solution at the heart of it. There's something in my system that feels like this is impossible. So getting creative with your client and building up solution. And like I said, there's no manual for that one. But I'll give you one example personally. When I was in elementary school, I got bullied a lot, which is part
of in Colombia.
Yes.
Okay.
It's part of why a lot of my trauma comes from there. So that's the main reason why I've always had a lot of social anxiety. People, especially groups, they don't feel safe to me. And more recently, I started practicing Kung Fu, and at one point, as I was working through some of my childhood wounds, I was seeing myself as a kid being completely overwhelmed and abused by other kids. And as a little kid, I saw myself wearing my Kung Fu uniform, and that changed everything.
Oh, cool.
Like, I brought solution to this memory in my system that didn't have solution.
Right.
And all of a sudden, this little 7-year-old had the strength and the power of somebody who knows Kung Fu. It's like, nobody's going to mess with me. And that little mind trick that I intuitively did actually had a huge impact. So I helped clients find things like that.
That's
so
beautiful.
It might be like if you got in a bad car crash, maybe get some nice winter tires. That might be enough solution. It's about
can help.
kind of being creative like that.
But so what you're also saying is like that memory is coming up, and you're all of a sudden seeing yourself back then with that Kung Fu uniform on. It's a beautiful example of how trauma from the past can be healed in the present.
Exactly.
And to me, if that wasn't possible, there would be no point to a lot of therapy, a lot of trauma therapy, right? What would we be doing? But we can. It can be healed.
We absolutely can.
Yeah.
And I go even further. This gets a little bit out there for some people, but I'm 100% convinced that we can heal systemically and intergenerationally.
Wow.
Like I said, this gets pretty out there, but I don't think time is really linear at all. I think it's an illusion, and I think our ancestors are all here with us, and they're part of this, of the field that we experience, and that we can heal ourselves, some of the wounds from the past, and heal them through it.
I love that. I think that's an awesome perspective to share and viewpoint to consider and think about. And for better or for worse, so many people, we don't know what our great-grandparents really were going through, or our grandparents for that matter. But, I think modern culture in America today, and probably a lot of the world more and more, we're disconnected from our past in a way that more traditional cultures would find unimaginable, right? Like, people used to know, oh, my great-grandparents lived in that house or in that spot, or this thing happened a few generations ago. And we're just, so cut off from all that.
Right, and that's
another subject, but the fact that whether or not we know intellectually that it can be here and it can be healed, I think it's a really powerful perspective. I think we need that. I think the world needs that.
Agreed. And the interesting thing, to bring it a little bit back to psychedelics.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm amiss for not asking you about this.
I know, that's fine. There's so much to talk about, but that's one of the places. Let me just start by saying one thing, which is, I say this in the training at Innate Path, that our nature is psychedelic. If we truly start to come closer to ourselves, reality gets strange sometimes. We tap into altered states of consciousness without any medicine. And in our subconscious, it's like it wants to be called in. If we crack the door open with whatever mechanism or technique that we know, it wants to express itself.
Mm.
So one of the main things is a lot of people that come to me, they I think because there is a bit of distortion in the mainstream view of psychedelics, they think that the psychedelics are the cure.
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell them, psychedelics are not the key. Your body is the key.
Mm.
At least the way I know how to work.
Mm.
Psychedelics just make it a little bit create a little bit more, more space for some of the pieces in the body to express themselves more.
I love that. That's a great message.
Mm-hmm.
To not look at psychedelic medicine as the cure, as a magic bullet, as I'm going to take this external substance and it's going to solve everything. Right? That's pretty naive, but even to have like the high, I don't know, there's a lot of hype, right? A lot of hopes and expectations, and they are super powerful and they can help with healing a lot. And at the same time, there's something more that's needed. The integration work, the day-to-day work, maybe I like what you're saying about the body. That's a good way to look at it. We're healing, or when you say body, I hear the word holistic, mind, spirit, body, energy, all together.
Yes.
And because the body is so often left out, that kind of encapsulates all of that, right?
Right. And the body, I think the body really holds direct line to the subconscious. Like our cognitive mind can only access a limited amount of our experience. But the body, my personal experience from working with the body is that the body has access to all of it, even memories that rationally you shouldn't have.
Yeah.
A lot of times people doing somatic work will go back to pre-verbal times when this has happened to me as a client, and I've seen this a few times where they just see themselves sometimes with incredible amount of clarity. And this is by the way, what I mean by the body leads you to it. It's usually we don't have a particular agenda of we're going to work on this thing today. We just start by checking in with the body. What is already active in the body? So at any given moment, there's already things that are triggered. So when the client settles down and starts to check in with themselves, they might say something like, I feel this uneasiness in my stomach. Okay, let's get curious about it. Let's look at it deeper. And then often, not always, but often when you give one of these somatic reactions your awareness, then they express themselves more. They get bigger. So maybe it becomes, oh, I feel some fear. Okay, let's go with the fear. And one of the main keys to this work is whatever comes up, we don't suppress it, because we're habituated, we're programmed in order to function in life to constantly being suppressing whatever's showing up in the body.
Right.
If there's fear, no, let's breathe through it. If there's some heartbreak, let's grab my phone and distract it. So we're always pushing it away, and we stop doing that. We allow all of it to just show up, emerge, and not fix it, because the body knows how to fix it. We're not trying to use our intellect to fix it. So continuing with the example, somebody's feeling all this charge, this churned stomach, this fear, and as you allow yourself to get more and more curious about how exactly you're feeling that in the body, how big is this sensation? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it fluttery? Is it whatever it is? Often the memories start to emerge spontaneously. You're not looking for a memory. You're not trying. You can do this, but most of the time you're not saying, let's work with this trauma that happened to you when you were 3.
Right.
The body leads you to it. That's why I say the body has the key to all memory and all subconscious experience. And sometimes as they're doing this, one thing that comes up pretty often is, again, the client isn't looking for it. They're looking for what's happening in their body. And as they look deeper and deeper, then all of a sudden they just have this clear image, often with a lot of detail, of, I'm in a dark room and I think I'm a little toddler.
Oh, wow.
And I am terrified and I am screaming my lungs out and nobody's coming. So things like that. You shouldn't you're not supposed to have memories of when you're 1 year old.
Right.
But people do.
You've seen that. And is this this process you're describing could happen with or without the use of psychedelic medicine?
Yes.
Is that accurate? Yeah.
Exactly. I'd say it's great to do it without medicine. I'm a fan of somatic work without medicine. And the reason most of my practice is with cannabis or ketamine is because it just makes it a little bit easier. What I find is when you're doing the work without medicine, it's not as fluid. It's more like you get the work in little bursts. You sort of dive into an experience for 30 seconds, and you come back out in the room, and then you go back a little bit in, and you come back out, which is okay, but the process tends to go slower and a little bit with more ease with the medicines, where you're just in it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you're more in these continual dream state where
Makes
you
so
are
much sense.
more in touch with subconscious. And one of the things that I say sometimes, and this didn't come from me, this came from my clients. A few clients said this to me at some point, where they said something like, after doing this work for several sessions, they said, I can do this without medicine. I can do the exact same thing. But I give myself more permission to be weird with the medicine.
It's a permission slip.
Yes, exactly. So
yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, when you're doing somatic work and your body's starting to move involuntarily, it's really strange. And it can be a little bit unsettling. Like,
Right.
why is my left shoulder shaking? But when you're on medicine, you're like, well, I'm just doing weird stuff because I'm high. And it's not, that's not the case, but it does give you permission.
Yeah, the permission slip. I think that this, the way you're describing it is so beautiful and so well said, and it will help people to understand the nature of the work you're doing and how different it would be than taking, having cannabis or ketamine in a different kind of setting, and how different it is. I mean, you could talk about like recreational use, whatever that means, but even a kind of ceremonial or even a mindful kind of experience with it, it's different when the aim is to dive into the body, the subconscious, to go towards the discomfort, to see what's there, to work through that stuff. And I'm not even putting a better or worse on it, because you can use, like we've had some people on the podcast, like you can use cannabis and meditation, you can have beautiful experiences, and I think it can help, a sense of relaxation, sense of bliss. Like I think it's important to be able to access that. But what you're describing a different kind of approach that's very, it's going to have a different effect or a different result.
Yes, and this is why anytime I start to work with somebody, one of the main things I tell them is, first off, this isn't a magic pill. This is going to take time and effort. And the second thing I tell them is, it's really hard. Because building what you're talking about, which is finding these expansive, blissful experiences, that's great. Everybody needs more of that. That just gives you more of a sense of trust in yourself, trust in life, empowerment, things like that are safety, that are super important. But the part of the work that I spend a lot of time in, that most people don't realize has a ton of value until you do it for a little while, is actually seeking out whatever's in my system that isn't pleasant. It's there for a reason. It's a sign. It's, the body and all its discomfort and its pain and its tension and things like that. It actually has a ton of wisdom. It's saying, hey, over here, something needs to be paid attention to. And that's where we spend a lot of our time. And I'd say there's always a balance. If somebody's just kind of in a torturous experience for a long time, then that's not helpful either. It can be feed a cycle of self-aggression or things like that. So you have, if my client isn't finding those blissful states, which also happen often enough, I get curious. What's not allowing you to feel them, and how can we cultivate that more too, so there's more balance. But I would say in general, we are seeking those signs in our body that are saying something doesn't feel right.
Right. It's like a sign that, there's something off or something that needs attention. Some kind of process there. Makes sense.
And medicine, you know, both medicines that I work with regularly, cannabis and ketamine, are brilliant for that, for actually kind of the opposite reasons. Cannabis is, depending on what strain and what dose, but in general, it tends to be, and I think more sativa than indicas. It's like an amplifier of these signals in the body.
Oh, okay.
It's one of the reasons why people say, "Oh, I get so anxious when I smoke weed,
Right.
especially sativa." I don't think they get anxious. I don't think the anxiety that was there just is in their face.
Right. Yeah.
So, and that's actually amazing for this work, because somebody who's not so connected to their body, which most of us in this culture, we're not very connected to our body.
Yeah.
When we start to pay attention, and the cannabis is on board, it's often very obvious. It's just like the shakiness, the tension, all that
Yeah.
starts to show up. So it helps build that bridge back towards the body. Ketamine is helpful for kind of the opposite reason, which is interesting. Ketamine is a dissociative, it's a relaxant, and for people who, when they start to feel the discomfort, when they start to feel the physical discomfort, the emotional discomfort, the painful memories, when they get too overwhelmed, it's like, this is too much, I can't handle this, and they just pop out of it. Ketamine brings in a little bit of that feeling of safety, usually, for most people, and it works different for some people, but because it calms you down and relaxes you, it gives you a bit of distance from whatever that charge is, so you can actually pay attention to it and not be completely blown out of the water by the intensity of it.
Yeah. Someone like, does the word safety blanket a little bit of sense of safety?
Exactly. Yeah, that's what it is, and ketamine is a strange substance, and if you've used it, it does kind of have that feeling somatically of something soft and maybe sort of heavy that's on the blanket.
Interesting. Yeah. The other thing I was thinking about when you were sharing that is just how helpful maybe these medicines are helping people to slow down, right, and notice these things and be present with them. And life can be so fast-paced and so busy and so much going on.
Yeah, and that's where we go back to set and setting, because so many people, especially in Colorado, are familiar with pot.
Right.
But they've rarely experienced it with this intentional focus of awareness. And in a setting of support and safety. And it makes all the difference. All the difference. I've had clients who, when I brought up the possibility of working with cannabis, their first thought was like, cannabis? I know that stuff. It just makes me sleep or giggle or whatever it is.
Right.
Makes me hungry. But then when they try it in this capacity, usually the feedback that I get is, wow, I didn't know that cannabis could open this up. So yeah, it goes back to the power of set and setting is just tremendous.
You know, it makes me think about something. A lot of people, their experience with cannabis is one of, oh, that makes me tired. I get cloudy. I get unclear. I'm not as sharp or focused. Or it can be. I'm not saying that's that's the experience that happens for a lot of people. I've experienced that myself. But this conversation around disassociation, I mean, that's coming from the speed, the busyness, the disassociation, rather than necessarily inherent in the substance itself. If that makes sense.
Yep, absolutely.
And if you can be really present with it, you might not have those effects.
Right. And it also reminds me of something I really want to share this thought, which is, I think a lot of people in the psychedelic movement and the psychedelic psychotherapy movement are a little bit too excited about people using these substances.
Right.
And I just want to say, mainly because I do come from a background of addiction work, that I'm pretty cautious. And I personally think that cannabis is a phenomenal tool when used sporadically. When you're using it every day, it tends to bring some of that fogginess, let's say.
Right.
Which is part, I think there is something to it. And
it's a good point. And it's maybe part of, hopefully, the conversation becoming more mature and all, but yeah, I am also kind of concerned about the excitement and enthusiasm around the psychedelic movement. I mean, inspiration and excitement are great, but I'm concerned about the potential backlash. I'm concerned about people's, hopes getting up and then feeling disappointed. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, of course, there's potential for abuse or, misconduct or all the things that are already, possible negatives are there too. It's not like it's different from that. So maybe just having like a realistic understanding of it. Yeah. Phew.
Yeah, so around all that, yeah, you just named like three different things that are pretty big in the psychedelic movement, and unrealistic expectations is a really big one.
Mm-hmm.
There is this, I think because the mainstream news and news in general, we tend to focus on the biggest, most exciting parts of anything.
Yeah.
So it creates a little bit of a skewed
Right.
perspective, because some people will have, I don't know, they'll go in the woods and take some mushrooms and have a life-changing experience that dramatically changes their life, for sure. That can happen. But I think there tends to be too much focus on those miraculous processes that happen with, went to Peru and had ayahuasca and this and that happened or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Most people's experiences are far from that. Most people have difficult experiences, and they're mixed in with the super transformative experiences.
Yeah.
And even traumatizing experiences.
It's a good
actually
point.
Quite
right?
common.
Common. It's certainly possible.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But then you need to work through that. And,
Exactly.
Yeah, there's the potential for that. I think, in Tibetan medicine, they talk about medicine can be a poison, and we have that perspective in like ancient Greek medicine too. It's not unique to Tibetan medicine, but the medicine is in the dose, or the medicine can be poison, or poison can be medicine. It's it's tricky. Even things like meditation we were talking about earlier, like what a wonderful gift, and then maybe a certain practice or style at some point, maybe it's not helpful. That's possible. You need to check in and evaluate if you're lifting weights too much and you overdevelop a certain muscle group, then you're out of balance. And so anything we do for health could become kind of not so helpful effects potentially, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another angle. I used to be pretty shy about speaking about this because it's strange.
Yeah.
But I think it's a really important part of especially the psychedelic psychotherapy angle of things, which is that I believe, so let me give you a quick background. I've been connected with Native, Colombian and American and Central American shamanic traditions for a long time.
Yeah.
And so, like you said, a holistic approach is acknowledging the body, but also energy and mind and spirit. And I think that these medicines open us up energetically in ways that, if not taken care of with a lot of responsibility, that they can create some harm too. I think that shamanic traditions that work with medicines, they know this, and they take many precautions. They do things like songs and bells and smudging with sage and different things, and that there's a wisdom to that in terms of taking care of the energy body too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that one of the reasons why psychedelic psychotherapy sometimes goes a little bit weird is because some of those precautions aren't being taken. And it's a strange one because psychotherapy is this Western academic thing, and it's sometimes frowned upon if you veered a little bit too into the esoteric.
Right.
But when you're doing this line of work, I think
Right.
I think it's just responsible for you to at least, hold that question of is there anything I can do to keep the space clear and safe?
I think it's absolutely critical, important. I'm not sure what to say. I guess I could say, just to reveal, or for my own practice as a therapist, I do think about that, and I do try to keep a clear energy space, for lack of a better word. I know the word energy sounds amorphous, and what does that really mean? And,
Right.
But in Vajrayana Buddhism, there's a lot of preparation of that you are in a protected, safe place. They don't use that language, but there's use the language of a protection sphere or protection circle, and that's in Western magical traditions too. A protection circle.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, however you do that, I do that for myself. I do that for my clients. I don't say that often.
Yeah, I mean,
But I'm holding that in my
yes.
my own awareness to some degree, especially with medicine, because I think you're absolutely right. But I think it's equally true for more so-called advanced meditation practices or yoga techniques or breath work. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about they're demonic entities or angelic entities that are, whether they're separate from you or not. I don't know, but there is a power in just setting the space, and that
Yes.
if something comes into that space, that it's protected, you can work with it. I don't know. I haven't talked about this that much on the podcast, but it's interesting.
I know it's an odd angle, and I know it's not spoken about much, which is why I bring it up more and more.
Yeah.
I used to feel uncomfortable talking about it.
Yeah.
But I do less, and and I'll say sometimes I refer some of my clients out to people who are specialists in this stuff. Just from my personal experience and background, I get the sense of there's something here that maybe can be addressed from the energetic side.
Yeah.
I refer them to traditional healers or energy workers, and I've had actually some really good feedback from my clients.
Oh, cool.
Doing that.
I was actually just talking to someone, this was in a social setting the other day, and they were describing seeing an energy worker. They were in some kind of training around coaching and meditation, and there was an energy worker, and they had what they described as an exorcism for themselves, where they had some trauma, they had this thing, they talked about it, and there was someone who was there who was a kind of exorcist, and they pulled this thing out of them, and it was a very powerful experience for them. And so whether or not that's ultimately or objectively true, in their own experience, that was a healing thing where they let go of something, and they felt different ever since, and they felt more clear, and they felt more free.
Yep.
And so, yeah.
I find that sometimes people do that for themselves in somatic work. I mean, often, I would say. They don't necessarily conceptualize it that way, but they feel that there's something that's dense and stuck and heavy or whatever it is. And as they're feeling the body, and the body's reacting to this sensation that they have in the body, there is a energetic purge. And that's how some of my clients would actually describe it. And again, this is getting into weird territory, but I think that there's something to it, that there's something that's happening not only on the psychological level, but purely on the energy level.
Yeah. I like to use the expression both and. Both and. There's a lot of possibilities here. There's a lot of ways of seeing. There's a lot of possible truths, possible experiences. I think one thing about the kind of entity kind of idea is that on some level it is you, and it's your experience. And if there's something in you that needs to be exercised, that's still your own process. And it's rather than this idea that there's these forces outside of you that are messing with you, there's something in you that opened that door.
Agreed.
Even if you get what I'm saying. So bring it back to yourself and your own experience, and not get too much into externalizing or But yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, there's so much. I feel like we could talk forever. I mean, before we started recording, I was naming something that I see as a shadow side of the whole psychedelic movement, which is the fact that right now there's people in the psych ward at the hospital who are there because they took a handful of dried mushrooms. They took some substance and had a really difficult experience. And I've worked with clients like that, and it can take them years, maybe more, to try to undo that, to try to come back to what feels like normal, to try to heal from that. And so these are super powerful things that can have, in the wrong setting, in the wrong situation, can have really, really profound effects. And we saw that, culturally in the 60s. And so to be able to hold these with a lot of sacredness, a lot of care, I think the set and setting is super, super important. And then there's got to be some kind of way of evaluating if someone what's the right medicine, the right situation for them, the right treatment for them, the right technique.
Yes.
Yeah. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, that's a really important piece. When I started working at Innate Path, it's really the first time that we know of that there was a clinic with several therapists working on somatic medicine-assisted work, right? And so we learned a lot from that experience. And one of the things that became clear very, very quickly is, like you said, how much this work is not a great fit for some people in some moments of their life. And this brings up a big conundrum, which is the people that need the most help, I think sometimes are not the right people to be doing psychedelics in general.
Oh, well.
And specifically to be doing psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. What I mean by that is these medicines are destabilizing in nature.
That's a great point. Right?
You know, that they amplify anything that is out of alignment, so that you can see it. They have this mirror quality where they show you where things aren't in balance, mentally, emotionally, and if you are already in a place in your life where you don't have ground, and you don't have much support, and you don't have great life skills, or you're already not taking care of yourself very well, you might have a big psychedelic experience. That's what pushes you over the edge. And in terms of the work that I do specifically, because it's not so much focused on finding these blissful psychedelic experiences, but actually going to the root of some of the wounds in your psyche, it is destabilizing. It's even more destabilizing, I think. So there is a you could say a minimum degree of stability that a person needs to be able to do this work, which is unfortunate. And I don't think that this is an absolute statement. I think that in an ideal situation, you could do this work with people that are in really dire situations, but it would just need so much more support. It would probably have to be in a residential facility, in nature, with a lot of support. Then you could probably do this kind of work. But somebody who's living alone in an apartment and severe depression and suicidality, and maybe with a little bit of, I don't know, psychosis or something, this isn't a good fit, because it's just going to push them over the edge.
Wow. Yeah, it's such an important conversation that the psychedelic assisted therapy community needs to be having, and hopefully more science studies and more, real data and real guidelines around. But then I think, to make it simple and to just kind of generalize, in general, like you said, psychedelics generally are more destabilizing, they're more opening. They're creating more openness. And for a lot of people who are more rigid and who are stuck in their ways and stuck in their habits and patterns, that can be a breakthrough. That's wonderful.
Absolutely.
For people who are already so open and all over the place, that might not be the thing. So that's kind of my general
That's
guideline.
great. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that idea. In terms of shifting rigid patterns, psychedelics are fantastic. They always tend to provide a alternate perspective.
Yeah, it's such a complex thing. I think support matters a lot. The life situation matters a lot. The individual situation obviously is critical.
Yeah, one of the big ones that we discovered very quickly at Innate Path is people who are very alone, who have very small support system, who don't have any really close buddies that they can call in the middle of the night if they're struggling, are a risky client to take on.
Oh, wow.
Because it's a lot to hold when you really start to unpack some of the big wounds. It's we as social beings, we need that connection and that support.
So maybe for someone like that, the first steps would be creating more social life, more connection, more support.
So I get a lot of clients who reach out to me and want to work, and I have a whole list of the things that for me are potential red flags. So I asked them about, what's your relationship to substances? Like, is this person getting high all the time and drinking all the time? Probably not a great fit. Have you had any very extreme mental states like mania or psychosis? And none of these are an absolute no, but when you have a few of them, it definitely can get risky. And oftentimes when I do find that there's a client who is looking to do psychedelic assisted work and they're not a good fit, I explain to them why they're not a good fit. I tell them, I don't want to do this with you because I don't want to hurt you. And I'm very happy to work with you in talk therapy and see if we can create the conditions where you can get to a place where you can. So for example, I have a couple of clients where I'm doing addictions work. And we're not doing any medicine work. Because they would probably start using way more in a very dangerous way.
Yeah, that's a whole big important topic for sure.
But if they stay sober for long enough and they have created a life that is rich and meaningful and they have a support system, then sure. That's what we're working on.
That's good. It takes integrity on your part and honesty. And
it's a hard conversation.
It's a little bit of I get the sense of a little bit of like the Wild West with it all. Like, like you are having
the Wild West.
This conversation, you've created these questions to ask, and you're using your experience and your insight and your judgment to help determine that. But there's not like real clear guidelines around this kind of thing, right?
Yeah, and that's why people who are in this field are often very excited of this work. And I can see why, because the potential is enormous. The reason I do it is because I don't know anything else that works as quickly and as profoundly. So I can see why people are excited, but I think that they're not careful enough sometimes, and that's creating a lot of problems. Like you said, people. There's this idea for in the psychedelic community sometimes that you kind of need to build up to these enormous doses to break your ego free, and sometimes people end up hurting their brains and not good.
Yeah, it's really worth talking about the potential and the amazing benefits that are possibly there, and then some of the risks. And like with so many things, like anything extreme is worth approaching with a lot of caution. It's often not the best. Yeah, I know people who had huge psychedelic experiences, like when they were in their late teenage years, and they still are affected by those today, 10, 15 years later. And then having a small amount of some psychedelic could like kind of trigger those memories or those experiences back for them. So it's definitely a potential danger that's worth. I really wish we had, I wish we had better education, knowledge, especially among teenagers, because that's younger people, college students, teenagers. They should, in my ideal world, there would be like a lot more education and openness around this. But there's that's maybe an age where I see more potential for extreme use and kind of trying to go to these extremes. I'm going to break through my ego forever. Let's do the heroic dose, and then let's do the heroic dose again next week. And it's dangerous. It is.
And I actually know a couple of people who are facilitating underground work that have that mentality. Well, they'll give people a full dose of mushrooms and a full dose of MDMA and a full dose of acid, and then just keep feeding them all night long because you need to break through. And
Wow.
and kind of horror stories of some of the outcomes of that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Phew. Back to the Wild West.
Yes,
Jeez.
exactly.
Interesting. Yeah,
It
there's
is
different...
the Wild West. It's very exciting in so many ways, and
Yeah.
you know, it's exciting to see that all over the country there's some very groundbreaking legislation
Yeah.
being proposed and passed, and legalization, and I think it just in the last maybe like 5 years it's really come in fully into the collective consciousness that these medicines are out there, and that there's
Yeah.
some
Yeah, it really is.
legitimate research that shows that it's helpful.
Yeah.
So there's this excitement.
Yeah.
And I think I'm all about the excitement, but I think sometimes it also needs a little bit sobering to it. And part of it is because, like I said, I worked with addictions, so I've met people who have probably permanent brain damage from using some substances, and also just people who amazing, brilliant, creative people that are just so hooked and they're stuck and you know 10 rehabs in a row and things like that.
That's expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Hopefully people can, like a podcast like this can help people to learn more and make their own informed choices and get to know themselves. And I think as you, I can speak for myself, but for people in general, like as you grow and develop, you get more a sense of what is helpful, what is needed, what's not helpful, and kind of become your own, start to take more responsibility for your own journey and your own healing and your own growth. Of course, the problem is when someone's really starting out or when they're really in crisis or struggling a lot or severe depression or whatever it is, anxiety, it's hard to have that awareness in you.
Yeah.
That's why if you come to a therapist, they're going to help you. I get scared hearing about like an underground person like that who's pushing someone to break through.
Yeah, there's a lot of desperation.
Right.
When it's you're at your wit's end and you feel like nothing has worked, and if you don't fix it, you're gonna probably kill yourself or something. Yeah. There's so much despair.
There's a lot of despair.
And there's not a lot of people who are trained in these modalities.
Right.
So there's a lot of I guess I'll just go and have anybody sit for me, and sometimes sometimes people don't really understand just how much can get unpacked with the help of psychedelics and then how to hold it, because it's not just you can come and have a tremendous 4-hour mushroom session or experience with yourself. But then really, you probably want to spend a couple of months at least integrating it.
Right.
And really gathering the whatever fruits you experience.
Spending time with it and coming back to your body, like you said, you're back to yourself. It makes me think about, the other thing it made me think about when you're sharing is, in the culture, psychedelics are a lot more known, and then ideas around trauma are a lot more known. And so I hear people in conversation kind of say kind of casually, oh, that person has a lot of trauma, they should go take some mushrooms. It's like so overly simplistic and just kind of like, just go do that and you'll be fine. And it's like, really? And really? That's going to solve everything?
And the thing is that a lot of the times it works.
Sometimes it'll work. Yeah, I'm not going to say it's never going to work, but yeah.
I know some people who, did just that. They went and did their own big mushroom trip and had a big breakthrough. So but those, like I said, those few somewhat miraculous stories, which are truly exist, are what people tend to focus on. Right. And then there's the other side of people who are very badly hurt by these medicines in the wrong context and the wrong dosages, and that isn't being spoken about enough, unfortunately. I feel like right now it's like there's a little bit of bubble bursting that's happening right here in this
Yeah.
conversation, but I think it's a sobering thing. It's not, like you said, it's not good or bad. It's medicine, poison, same thing,
Mm-hmm.
depending on how you use it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we need is more out in the open, more research and more training
Yeah.
and I think really one of the reasons why so many people are having horrible experiences is because it's illegal.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so it's all done hidden
Mhm.
and without the support that
The hidden quality definitely opens up the potential for more abuse and more negative outcomes. Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks so much for being on the podcast. This is a really rich conversation. Got more depth, so I appreciate that a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah, we went to a lot of places for sure.
Give
Thanks for having me.
give people some food for thought.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of A State of Mind podcast. As always, if you'd like to support this, one of the easiest and free ways to do so is just share about it with your own friends and family on your own social media accounts. You can leave us positive reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And as always, you're welcome to call in or write us, send us your messages, questions, feedback, inquiries. All of that is welcome. You can learn more about my other work that I do as a therapist, meditation teacher, and coach at astateofmindcounseling.org. And if you'd like to directly support the show and become a member, you will receive some guided meditations as well as additional art and music and other things that we are cooking up here. You can do that at patreon.com/astateofmind. Thank you so much, and I will see you here next time.